In the last week of May 1943, on a treeless island at the far edge of the Aleutian chain, a group of American soldiers walked into a shattered field hospital and found something the United States Army had not expected to find in such quantity: paper, notebooks, personal diaries, half-burned unit records. Letters addressed to wives and children who were thousands of miles away in Japan and who would never receive them. The fighting on Attu Island had ended that morning in a suicidal charge that overran an American command post before collapsing under rifle fire and hand-to-hand combat. What remained afterward was a battlefield littered with the private words of the men who had just died on it. 19 days of combat had produced one of the costliest engagements per soldier engaged in the entire Pacific War. It had also produced an unusually rich paper trail because Japanese soldiers of this era were required, and in many cases personally inclined, to keep a diary. When the shooting stopped, American intelligence officers realized they were not just holding a battlefield, they were holding a written record of what it felt like to lose one. To understand why those documents mattered, it helps to understand where Attu sits and why anyone was fighting over it at all. Attu is the westernmost island in the Aleutian archipelago, a scattering of volcanic rock strung across the North Pacific between Alaska and the Kamchatka Peninsula. It is closer to Japan than to Seattle. In June of 1935, testifying before the United States Congress, General Billy Mitchell had already flagged the region's strategic weight, arguing that whoever controlled Alaska would hold a commanding position over the Pacific. Japanese military planners reached a similar conclusion from the other direction. In June 1942, in an operation timed to coincide with the attack on Midway, Japanese forces landed on Attu and the neighboring island of Kiska. It was the first time an enemy power had occupied American soil since the War of 1812. The Unangaks, the indigenous residents of Attu, were removed from their homes and taken to Japan, where 16 of the 40 captives would die of disease and malnutrition before the war ended. For nearly a year, the United States left the islands in Japanese hands while it fought urgent battles elsewhere in the Pacific and in Europe. American air power harassed the garrisons through the winter of 1942 into 1943, but a ground assault to physically retake the islands was delayed by weather, by shipping shortages, and by the low priority Washington placed on a remote outpost with little economic value. That changed in the spring of 1943, when planners decided the Aleutians could no longer be left to Japan, both for reasons of national prestige and because an undisturbed Japanese foothold on American territory was intolerable to sustain indefinitely. On May 11, 1943, after a sustained air campaign, roughly 11,000 soldiers of the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division began landing on Attu's beaches, expecting the operation to last a matter of days. They were wrong, and the reason they were wrong is itself part of the historical record. The island's terrain and climate were treated by planners almost as an afterthought when they should have been treated as a second enemy. Attu has no trees, little level ground, and near constant fog. Willowa winds can rise from a calm sea to hurricane force in minutes. The ground underfoot is a spongy tundra called muskeg, which swallows boots, vehicles, and traction alike. American troops arrived with equipment designed for temperate combat, not Arctic exposure, and cold weather casualties from frostbite and immersion foot would eventually rival combat wounds in number. Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, the Japanese officer commanding the roughly 2,650-man garrison, made a decision that compounded the American difficulty. Rather than contest the landing beaches, which he could not realistically hold against naval gunfire, he withdrew his men into the high ground overlooking the invasion routes. The Americans came ashore almost unopposed and then spent the following weeks fighting uphill, through fog, against an enemy they frequently could not see, for ridgelines with names that would become permanent fixtures in American military memory: Massacre Bay, Holtz Bay, Jarman Pass, Fishhook Ridge, and finally Engineer Hill. This is the point in the story where most general accounts of Attu turn to tactics and casualty figures. This account turns instead to the men who wrote things down while it was happening, because their words survived the battle, even though most of them did not. The single most consequential of these documents belonged to a Japanese army doctor named Paul Nobuo Tatsuguchi. His path to the Aleutians began nowhere near a battlefield. Tatsuguchi had studied medicine in California, first at Pacific Union College and then at the College of Medical Evangelists, now Loma Linda University, receiving a California medical license in 1938. He was a Seventh-day Adventist and had planned a career as a medical missionary. He returned to Japan to practice medicine and married a woman named Tiko. He was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1941, before the outbreak of the Pacific War, and was eventually assigned as a medical officer to the North Sea detachment sent to garrison the Aleutians. He kept a diary throughout the deployment as required, and continued writing in it through the Battle of Attu itself, even as he worked without rest in a field hospital that was, by the battle's final week, absorbing more wounded than it had any capacity to treat. The diary is a document written by a man watching a military catastrophe unfold in close and personal detail, one day at a time, with no illusions about where it was heading. In mid-May, the entries describe air raids, naval gunfire, and a steady stream of wounded arriving at the field hospital, along with a note that American forces appeared to include a large number of Black and Native American soldiers, a detail of interest to Japanese intelligence at the time. By May 16, with the position at Chichagof Harbor threatened, the entries record an order to burn documents, and in the event the position collapsed, to end the suffering of patients who could not be moved. By May 21, the diary notes that the field hospital's commanding officer had told his men he expected to die the next day and had already given away his personal effects. By May 27, with rations for less than 1,000 men remaining from a force that had started the battle several times that size, the entries describe severe dysentery, morphine and opium taken simply to sleep, and a building sense that the end was near. The final entry, dated May 29, describes euthanizing the remaining hospital patients with grenades before the last attack, and closes with farewell lines to his wife and children, one of whom had been born that February and whom he would never see. Tatsuguchi was killed that same day, either during or immediately after the final Japanese assault. American troops recovered the diary from his body. It was translated by Army intelligence officers of the 7th Infantry Division's G2 section within days, in a document dated June 1, 1943, and headed simply as a translation of a captured enemy diary from the field hospital area the Americans had nicknamed Massacre Valley. That translation, along with several other diaries and letters recovered on the island, went on to serve two very different purposes. In the short term, it fed directly into operational intelligence. American commanders used captured Japanese diaries and correspondence, cross-referenced against frontline observation, to reconstruct Japanese unit strengths, supply conditions, and command decisions in the final days of the battle. In the longer term, Tatsuguchi's diary became one of the most widely read and most frequently misread Japanese personal documents to emerge from the entire Pacific War, reprinted in various forms in the American press during the war years as an illustration of Japanese resolve. Often stripped of the biographical context that would have shown readers a Christian medical missionary trying, in his final entries, to spare his patients unnecessary suffering rather than a caricature of blind fanaticism. Tatsuguchi was not the only Japanese officer whose words survived him on Attu, and his diary should be understood as the clearest example of a much larger phenomenon rather than an isolated find. Diary keeping was standard practice in the Imperial Japanese Army, encouraged as a form of personal discipline and record, and American forces in the Pacific quickly learned that captured diaries were an intelligence asset almost as valuable as captured maps. On Attu, the scale of the discovery was unusual. When the 7th Infantry Division secured the island at the end of May 1943, its intelligence sections came into possession of a substantial cache of documents, diaries, letters, and photographs, along with motion picture footage that had been carried by Japanese units, including some of the only Western-held film of Japanese naval operations elsewhere in the war, among it footage related to the sinking of the British cruisers HMS Cornwall and HMS Exeter earlier in the conflict. The written material taken together gave American analysts something they rarely had at this stage of the Pacific War: a first-person, day-by-day account of what a Japanese garrison experienced as it was destroyed. The content of these documents, read collectively rather than as isolated curiosities, traces a consistent arc. Early entries from units and officers writing before the American landing or in its first days describe routine garrison duty, weather complaints, and confidence in Japan's ability to reinforce and hold the island. As the battle progresses through mid-May, the tone across multiple writers shifts toward exhaustion, frustration with the terrain and weather, and growing alarm at the volume of American naval and air bombardment, which several diarists describe as constant and overwhelming compared to anything they had previously experienced. By the last week of May, the surviving entries converge on a small number of recurring themes: dwindling rations, the impossibility of properly treating the wounded, communications breakdowns between units cut off from one another by terrain and fog, and an awareness expressed with a bluntness that surprised the American officers who read them, that the garrison had no realistic hope of rescue. Several diarists described destroying documents on order in anticipation of being overrun, which is precisely what makes the surviving fragments valuable. They represent what was written in the days just before that order came, and in some cases, like Tatsuguchi's, what was written even after. Colonel Yamasaki himself left a documented trail of decisions, if not a diary in the same personal register as his medical officers. Facing annihilation, with roughly 800 able-bodied men and 600 wounded remaining from a garrison that had begun the battle near 2,650 strong, Yamasaki made the calculation that would define how Attu is remembered. Surrender was not an option he considered available to him. Japanese military culture at the time operated under the Bushido Code, which treated surrender as a profound dishonor, one that could bring shame not only to the soldier, but to his family at home. The historical record includes accounts of Japanese wives taking their own lives after learning a husband had been captured rather than killed. With that framework governing his decision, and with no prospect of relief, Yamasaki chose to attack. On the evening of May 28, he ordered his papers burned, and he ordered that wounded soldiers unable to join the assault be killed rather than left to be captured, a directive Tatsuguchi's diary describes carrying out with morphine and grenades. Before dawn on May 29, Yamasaki assembled what remained of his command and led them personally, sword in hand, in a mass charge intended to break through American lines, seize an artillery position on high ground the Americans had begun calling Engineer Hill, and use the captured guns and supplies to prolong Japanese resistance until reinforcements could arrive by sea. The charge came close to succeeding, which is part of why it entered American military memory so forcefully. It struck at a seam between forward combat units and rear echelon troops, catching engineers, medical personnel, and headquarters staff who were not deployed or equipped for a frontal infantry assault. For a period of intense, close-quarter fighting, American positions on the crest of the hill were genuinely in danger of being overrun. It was, by American accounts, the first time in the war that United States soldiers had directly experienced a mass Japanese charge of this kind, a tactic that would recur, in variations, at later Pacific battles including Saipan and elsewhere, and that shaped how American commanders would come to anticipate and prepare for the final stages of dug-in Japanese defenses. American troops, many of them from support and engineering units rather than frontline infantry, held the position with rifles, bayonets, and improvised close combat. Yamasaki was killed leading a later wave of the same attack. By the following day, May 30, only 28 to 29 of the roughly 1,400 Japanese soldiers who had gathered for the final assault and its aftermath remained alive to be taken prisoner. American burial details subsequently interred 2,351 Japanese dead in mass graves on the island, with historians estimating several hundred additional bodies remain in the hills to this day. The American cost was severe by any standard. 549 soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division were killed, and more than 3,000 were wounded or incapacitated by cold weather injury, a casualty rate that would be exceeded in the Pacific Theater only at Iwo Jima. Measured against the size of the forces engaged, Attu ranks among the costliest American battles of the entire war, a fact made more striking by how little public attention the battle received at the time, overshadowed by concurrent operations elsewhere and by the sheer geographic obscurity of the Aleutians themselves. What happened to the captured documents after the guns fell silent is its own chapter in the story, and arguably the one with the longest institutional consequences. The diaries, letters, and other papers recovered on Attu were consolidated by Army intelligence and fed into a broader effort then underway to build a systematic understanding of the Imperial Japanese Army, an effort that drew on similar document captures from the Solomon Islands and New Guinea campaigns happening around the same time. Analysts used this material, cross-referenced against combat observation, to compile technical assessments covering Japanese weapons, artillery employment, infantry organization, and the design of field fortifications and bunkers, material that fed directly into how American forces trained for and anticipated subsequent island campaigns in the Central and Western Pacific. In a narrower but no less important sense, the diaries also functioned as tactical intelligence in real time during the battle itself. Information drawn from captured letters and diaries, combined with reports from American ground commanders, helped identify the tactics Japanese defenders were using on Attu and informed how those tactics could be anticipated and countered, a lesson explicitly noted in the U.S. Army's own subsequent accounts of the campaign. Tatsuguchi's diary in particular took on a life beyond its immediate intelligence value. In the months after the battle, portions of it circulated in American press coverage as an illustration of the psychological state of a defeated Japanese garrison, often presented with little of the biographical nuance that would only become widely known decades later, when historians and journalists traced Tatsuguchi's American medical education, his religious convictions, and the circumstances of his death in more careful detail. That fuller picture emerged gradually, through subsequent research including the work of writers who interviewed surviving American veterans of the battle, among them the soldier who fired the shots that killed Tatsuguchi during the final charge, a man who reportedly carried the weight of that encounter, once he understood who Tatsuguchi had been for the rest of his life. Decades after the battle, the diary and the story surrounding it were revisited in book-length historical work and in television documentary coverage, which traced a line from the muddy hillsides of Attu in 1943 to a reconciliation, generations later, between the American soldier's family and Tatsuguchi's surviving relatives in Japan. The broader legacy of Attu, and of what its Japanese defenders wrote before they died there, extends into several distinct areas that deserve to be traced separately, because they did not all move at the same pace or in the same direction. Militarily, the intelligence drawn from the Attu documents fed into an evolving American understanding of how the Japanese army would fight as the Pacific War moved toward the home islands. Yamasaki's decision to abandon the beaches and defend from high ground, rather than contest the landing directly, along with his decision to end the battle with a mass infantry charge rather than surrender, previewed patterns American forces would encounter again in different forms on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Commanders and planners preparing for those later, far larger battles drew on lessons first documented in part through the paper trail recovered on this single, small, fog-bound island in the Aleutians. Historically and archivally, the diaries recovered on Attu became part of a growing body of captured Japanese personal writing that historians on both sides of the Pacific have used in the decades since to reconstruct the individual, human experience of the Imperial Japanese Army from the inside, a perspective that official unit records and post-war interviews alone could not provide. The National Park Service, which today administers the battlefield as part of the Aleutian Islands World War II National Historic Area, draws directly on Tatsuguchi's diary as its primary source for describing the daily conditions Japanese soldiers experienced on the island, a testament to how much of what is known about that side of the battle rests on a single medical officer's notebook. Diplomatically and personally, the story did not end with the war. Japan has periodically sent expeditions to Attu to search for and repatriate the remains of soldiers still buried on the island, work that continued into the 21st century, and that has, on occasion, turned up additional physical traces of the men whose written words had already told part of their story. The relationship between the Tatsuguchi and Laird families, forged out of one American soldier's guilt and one Japanese doctor's diary, stands as a smaller but no less telling coda, a private reconciliation built on public historical record decades after the fact. Today, Attu is uninhabited. The Coast Guard maintained a presence there for years before withdrawing. The ammunition sheds the Japanese garrison used still stand in the tundra, and the same fog that hid Yamasaki's men from American aircraft in 1943 still rolls across the same hillsides. What makes the battle more than a footnote in Pacific War history is not only its casualty rate, severe as that was, but the unusual density of first-person testimony it left behind, most of it written by men who knew, as they wrote it, that they were unlikely to survive to see it read. Paul Tatsuguchi's diary closes with a farewell to wife and children he would never see grow up, written hours before he died carrying out his commander's final order. Colonel Yamasaki's decision to burn his own papers before leading the last charge was, in its way, an acknowledgement of exactly what those documents were worth, a record of defeat too honest to leave behind for the enemy, and because he was not entirely successful in destroying it, a record that outlived him anyway. That is the enduring value of what was found on Attu after the fighting stopped. It is not a story told by victors summarizing an enemy's failure from a safe distance. It is a story told in fragments by the men who lost, in their own words, on the days they lost it. 80 years later, those words remain the clearest window historians have into what it felt like to be on the losing side of one of the loneliest, coldest, and least remembered battles of the Second World War.